I just wanted. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I think we're just going to give everybody a minute or two to get in the room and we'll get started. But thank you for being here. We're super excited to see you. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Chang. I am a member of the board at the NFOIC, and my day job is I'm the director of the government practice at Practical Law. Practical Law is a legal know-how product, and I head up a team of very experienced former government attorneys that write resources to help current government attorneys do their jobs better and more efficiently. I'm so thrilled to welcome you guys here today for this blockbuster panel. And today we're going to talk about something that we don't often talk about too much, and that is successes in FOIA. Now, I'm not saying that the road to success is always straightforward, maybe a little tortured, but nonetheless, I think it's always good to hear about how not only are we successful in obtaining documents, but how those documents can really break huge stories wide open. I'm thrilled to present to you today our panel of very esteemed experts. We have with us today Nate Jones, and Nate is the FOIA director for the Washington Post, where he works with reporters to target documents to request, appeal, and sue for. He works with reporters to obtain local, state, and federal records and to think strategically about public records in all formats. He gives FOIA training sessions, advises reporters on how to write and refine requests, navigate delays and over redactions, and overcome other bureaucratic resistance. He also oversees a newsroom-wide system to track open records requests. He was previously the director of the FOIA project for the National Security Archive, where he wrote a book on the 1983 Able Archer nuclear war scare. He served 2 terms on the Federal FOIA Advisory Committee and holds a JD from the University of the District of Columbia. Just side note, Nate let us know the good news that he passed the bar last week, so a huge congratulations to him. Our second panelist is Mike Pell. Mike is a reporter on the Reuters Data and Enterprise team. His work has exposed fraud in privatized U.S. military housing, identified hundreds of communities across the country with alarming rates of childhood lead poisoning, and revealed how COVID lockdown measures, including school closures, harm the health, safety, and development of children. He assists colleagues with open records projects in the US and abroad. So welcome, Mike. And our third panelist is Ann Weissman. Ann currently serves as outside counsel to the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington and the Project on Government Oversight. And she was the former chief counsel and chief FOIA counsel for CREW. I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with CREW, but it's no exaggeration to say that CREW has been a giant in the FOIA space for decades and has really uncovered a staggering number of public interest stories that really have changed the course of history. So I am thrilled to present this panel, and I hope that everyone is going to have a ton of questions for our panelists. We're going to hold the questions until the conclusion of the speakers' presentations, but please throw the questions either into the chat in the Zoom window, or also there's a chat and a Q&A function in Whova, whichever is easier for you guys, whichever works best. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nate.
Sure. Hey guys. Thank you very much, Grace. Thanks for having me. And I've always learned so much from every NFOIC event I attend, and great to be here again. So I'm going to try, I'm not going to take up too much time because I want to answer your guys' questions, but I'm going to try and tell a FOIA story and work in some advice I have along the way. So the story actually, Grace asked if we would say a FOIA success, and I thought that we were going to publish on this story on Monday or Tuesday, but you never know in the news business. But thankfully, a big story at the Washington Post that's been based on a 2-year FOIA fight published, I guess, yesterday. And it's a story showing that there are over 500 retired military personnel working for the governments of foreign countries, and some Saudi Arabia, Libya, United Arab Emirates, with pretty horrendous human rights violations. And part of the story is look at where these retired generals and admirals are working. Did you know that? And part of the story is, did you know that the government fought for 2 years to keep this secret? So with that, I'll briefly tell the story. So it all came about because me and my co-author, Craig Whitlock, a great reporter, do a thing that I would urge all people that do FOIA or public records to do, and think with a document frame of mind. And every day you read the newspaper, read the stories, and think, what documents are there? And around 2015, Craig, not me, Craig was reading the newspaper, and he saw the story of Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who was this time in a bit of hot water for attending a dinner with Vladimir Putin for Russia Today. And it bubbled up, and eventually a couple of years later, Flynn was investigated for violating the Foreign Emoluments Act of the Constitution. I won't go too deep into it, but it essentially means that he accepted documents from a foreign government without getting permission, and he was a retired military officer. So that was a good story. People wrote about it. But what Craig and eventually I did was take the next step, and we thought about, how did he get in trouble? And we looked at the Inspector General's investigations, and in there it said that he had failed to apply. And if someone failed to apply, that means that there's probably an application. So we looked around and we found 1 or 2 applications that were public. I think they'd been released under FOIA, which brings me to my second point. The first was document state of mind. Second point is replicate what's already been released. As maybe Grace knows, the government is always battling in court, trying to convince judges to make FOIA harder and harder to release information. And Anne and Mike and others and the Post are doing the opposite. Sadly, I think the courts are kind of making it more difficult to get information, chipping away. Certainly look at the Supreme Court with Argus Leader, like you probably talked about last panel. But the point is that if you go in front of a judge and say, this is the exact document, exact contract, exact application that we're requesting that's already been released by FOIA, you are probably going to get it. And you're probably going to get it without going to court too. So replicate what's already been released. So we found some of these application for foreign government services that had already been released, and we replicated the FOIA and filed the FOIA request with the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, and the Department of State, and all of them had to approve these requests. The tough part, I'll level with you. We knew as soon as we filed those requests that we were going to have to sue for these. If you look at the Department of State's website, their oldest pending request is from 2006. And that's not that much of an anomaly. For some government agencies, not all, there's probably maybe 75% of government agencies will get you records lickety split. So file with them is good advice. But for the 25% of bad ones, sometimes you have to sue. The good news is if you sue and substantially prevail, almost always you'll get attorney's fees, which means the government pays you to sue them to enforce the law. So it's a twisted life we live in, but we're FOIA folks. That's how it goes. That said, we sued, and fortunately, FOIA allows you, because the records related back to the same applications, we could sue 5 agencies with 1 lawsuit, which was convenient. And we sued, and before too long, the judge absolutely sided with us. He said, agencies, you have no good reason to withhold these records. You violated FOIA's 20-day time limit, and I'm essentially going to do your job for you and tell you to release these records within 2 months, essentially, which they did. Now we got them all. We said, oh boy, there's not just one application. We didn't know how many there would be. And it turned out there was about 500 applications, and tabulated them, looked them up, and built the story, did normal reporting, asked for comment, talked to experts, and took a long time. It was a long FOIA fight. But they don't always have to be. Part of my job in the newsroom is reporters come to me and say, yeah, you and Whitlock did a good job, but I don't have 2 stinking years. And this is when I go into my mode of saying, look at FOIAs like planting acorns. File a few every week. Every time you read the paper, think about where a document exists and file for it. And what I tell them is that before too long, that work will be creating stories for you. I guarantee after a couple months, if you actually file a couple FOIAs, 2 FOIAs every week, documents will start coming in and you'll say, oh yeah, I forgot I FOIA'd about that. But here's a ready to go document-based story, slap it right on the website, sexy FOIA win story that kind of does your job for you. So you don't have to sue for everything. Absolutely not. Finally, my last point, and I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleagues, is public records favor the hungry. That's why I love them. We're in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of Bob Woodward reporters that get interviews with the president, get senators to talk off the record, have an incredible amount of access that most of these reporters have already arguably earned. It's a joke. But in Washington, D.C., reporters sometimes rest on their laurels a little bit because people feed them so much. But most reporters are not in Washington, D.C., and a huge chunk of reporters in Washington, D.C. are nose to the grindstone, shoes on the pavement, working hard. And for those ones that don't have any access, are new to the game, are hungry, but people aren't returning their calls, public records favor you because they favor the people that put in the hardest work. FOIA officer in any of the departments does not care if you're Bob Woodward or lowly Nate Jones. They need to process your record the same way. So that is why FOIA is such a great tool for young, hungry reporters. File a lot of them and they will produce, and you have to wait just as long as the next guy, and you can use that to your advantage. So with that, thanks to everyone and look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Nate. I love that idea of thinking of FOIA requests as acorns. That's a really good way of thinking about it. Okay, so I am going to drop a link to the Washington Post story in the chat. But in the meantime, let's move to our second panelist, Mike Pell. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I am neither young nor Bob Woodward, but hopefully I'm a little bit hungry here. So that was great, Nate. Hey, so the way that I've been thinking about FOIA, and it's kind of evolved over the years. When we used to do these kind of talks with colleagues at Reuters or at the other places I've been, it was always just like maybe kind of an angry young man type thing that you just have to badger people into submission. And I call every day, and treat them like bad dogs, FOIA officers. And it was terrible and it's awful, but I think it really struck a chord with a lot of reporters who are unsatisfied with the 25% of government agencies that didn't respond. But I think that I've no longer being young, perhaps I've modified my approach a little bit. And I think about reporting or FOIAs now as kind of reporting versus fishing expeditions, so to speak. Because that's what it often comes down to, is you talk to reporters and they want to throw out a FOIA and they kind of hope that there will be a magical return and oh, there you go, done. And there's these documents and that made a fantastic story. But I think that what I've seen is that reporting, you don't turn your reporters cap off when you go into these FOIAs. And the more you think about it, the more legwork you do, I think the more success that you have. And the less you have to bother people like Nate and the lawyers at your news organization, especially if you're at a news organization that doesn't have somebody like Nate, or if you're at an organization that doesn't have somebody like Ann there that you can rely on. And I think that most reporters really are their own FOIA legal team, for better and for worse. And so what the four main components of the four main FOIAs that I think about are, you already have the documents that you want, and you're just going through the FOIA process to acquire them officially. You already know what documents exist, but you're going to try to get them. You think these documents might exist, and you're going to find out by issuing a FOIA request. And then the fourth is the pure fishing expedition, and you're just blindly casting about, hoping that you get something. This is the one that I really hope not to be a part of, but every once in a while, and an editor asks you to do something that you think might not be all that smart. Okay, and so here's then how I approach it technically. A few years ago at Reuters, myself, Deb Nelson, Joshua Schneier, and Andrea Januna and I started a project looking at privatized military housing. This was something that was very new to us. We didn't realize that 98% of all military base housing had been privatized. And we had heard stories of lead poisoning, of rats, mold, really slum-like housing. And we wanted to find out more about this. We knew that we were going to issue FOIAs. We knew that obtaining documents would be critical to the reporting process. The way that we started out was talking to current and former employees of the agencies that we were going to FOIA, talking to current and former employees of the private housing companies that were involved, talking to people, anybody that was involved with either the companies or the agencies, other vendors, lawyers that had sued the companies, lawyers that had sued the agencies. And then also reading up on, this is something that Nate mentioned that I thought is so smart, it's just to go to GAO, Inspector General reports. Even, especially if you're looking for data, the systems are often designed by private contractors or the data is held by private contractors. And you'll often find vivid descriptions of the data systems on these company websites. That just knowing as much about it can be critical, because you'll get pushback all throughout the process. If you can show up front that you understand the process, it'll make you sound much more legitimate. And I think make it much more easy to respond to your request. And so with the housing story, eventually we got to the point where I'd obtained just voluminous documents from all of these sources. And in order to protect some of the sources, I issued open records requests and obtained, bonus reports, military housing inspection reports, and other inside documents, emails that have been exchanged between the company and Air Force officials that really demonstrated that these companies had abused the lack of oversight by the Air Force to fraudulently change work order requests, their maintenance data, to show that they had been keeping up on the houses, to show that the houses were in good condition when they really weren't. And so not only did this make it look like military families were not living in slum-like conditions, but it also made them eligible for millions of dollars in incentive fees. Ultimately, the result of this story was that the Department of Justice brought an investigation. Balfour Beatty, one of the largest military contractors in the military housing companies in the country, was found guilty of major fraud. They had to pay about $65 million in fines and criminal penalties. They are still a housing contractor for the military, which is interesting. And then there were a couple of their employees that faced criminal penalties as well. And this was based partially on FOIA documents, and also partially on the groundwork that we did, the legwork that we did in order to get those FOIA documents. The second part of this is making it easy for government officials to respond. Nate, I'm sure you deal with this a lot, and I'm sure you do as well, that you talk to people that when they're issuing a FOIA request, you want to get it done, you want to get it in soon, you want to get it in quickly, but ultimately that makes it take longer because you weren't sufficiently accurate and detailed in your initial request. So, and this brings me to the second example that I used that was for a story that we did on lead poisoning, childhood lead poisoning. It was after Flint, Michigan. This was kind of like what Nate said. You're reading a story thinking, oh my gosh, that's tragic, that's horrible. And my colleague Josh Schneier and I thought, where's the next Flint, Michigan? Where are the other Flint, Michigans? Or is Flint really that unique? Because it garnered so much national attention, as well as it should have. And so we did a story about this town in East Chicago, Illinois, where the CDC had bungled this health review and allowed a community to remain in place on top of an old lead smelter site. And they had said that, don't worry about it. The blood lead level tests of the kids there are fine. We're the CDC, trust us. Well, the CDC did a terrible job. And Josh actually found that the state of Indiana had blood lead level tests on census tract level that showed, no, actually this census tract is among the highest in the state. And it's just that census tract. If you look where the lead plant was, if you look around it, not so much. And so we did that story. It was really cool. We thought that was fun. But then Josh and I kind of looked at each other afterwards and said, gosh, I wonder if other states have this kind of granular data. So using the data from Indiana and then also going out and reporting, we issued FOIA requests to states across the country. And so in order to make it easier, know the names of the documents that you want. In this case, we didn't know exactly what each state called the documents that we were looking for, but we had Indiana as an example. And so that's the other thing that we that I found can help, using examples from other states within the agency, other documents that are simple. And so we could describe it in the similar ways. Know who the custodians of the records are. If you can put in your FOIA request who actually holds the records, that helps. In this case, we could say, hey, it's the Department of Health, or in some states it's different, but know the format that the records are stored in. This can be tricky, but you can do this, especially when it comes to data. People might say, oh gosh, we can't actually provide this to you because we keep it in a SQL Server database and, we can't get it out of there. We go, oh yeah, that's absolutely amazing. Don't worry about it. I can write the SQL code for you to export it. Don't worry, it's fine. This will work. Know the time frame of the data that you're looking for. That was something, hey, do you want 20 years, 30 years? That's an easy one. Have backup sources. Nothing ever works out. I think we all know this. Everything always kind of goes awry at the last second. In this case, we had many states that were recalcitrant. Sometimes I couldn't tell if they were recalcitrant, lazy, or just dumb. It was, I just have no idea. But you run into them. So what happened was we determined through our reporting that the states were required to report this data to the CDC. So we issued another FOIA request to the CDC. And I'll tell you what was satisfying. When the state of Ohio told us over and over and over again, we don't have the data, we don't know what you're talking about, we're not responding to your FOIA request. Reuters wasn't going to sue. It wasn't going to happen. We thought we had really good evidence that they did have the data. And it turns out that they did, because they had been reporting it to the CDC, and we obtained, I think it was 10 years worth of Ohio's data from the CDC. And when we questioned them prior to publication about their data, that felt pretty darn good. And so having backups, I think, is also, always think outside the box. Where else is your data? Where else are your records going in the process? Because oftentimes it can go to a different agency, it can go to a different level of government. Yeah, so those are my thoughts on how to FOIA.
Thanks, Mike. Those are some really great tips. And I especially like the breakdown of the 4 types of FOIA requests, because I think that's a really, it's a really important thing to remember, as you're sort of going through your process. And, it's also in descending order of likelihood of success, when you, are doing more of a fishing expedition. It is much harder to pinpoint the kinds of records. And from, speaking from the agency side, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned in my intro that I spent 10 years at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, 5 years at ICE, and then the last 5 at headquarters as their senior FOIA counsel. And, definitely the more detail you can provide, the better it is for everybody. So,
and I think that's
really
fair too for the government agency. A lot of my colleagues say, okay, I'm sorry, one more example here.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
My colleagues, I talk a lot to them about emails. They want emails. Okay, I'll take the emails from your agency, between anybody at your agency and anybody at ExxonMobil for the last 5 years. Okay, this is not, that's just a tremendous amount of work that you're putting on them. And it's a fishing expedition. You don't know what you're looking for. You don't know what you want. Let's get a time frame. Let's get like 3 people. I think it's reasonable to have expectations of ourselves as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that is a great point. And, I'll just say this one thing. What we found oftentimes when we'd get a request that, was a little bit more vague or asked for a lot of material, is that an agency can very easily have hundreds of thousands or millions of pages of records that you are completely not interested in. And, it's a dump. They're all image files. OCRing is a little iffy. You might be able to search them, you might not be able to search them. And I think nobody wants to receive, hundreds of thousands of pages of records about stuff that they don't care about. So I think, it definitely is a benefit to both sides to be as precise as you can. Okay, so I don't want to suck up any more of the time. Thank you so much, Mike. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Anne.
Thanks, and thank you for having me. So I'm a little different than Nate and Mike in that I'm not a journalist. I don't work for journalists. All my FOIA work has been on behalf of good government, nonprofit groups that are sort of dedicated to government transparency and government accountability. But, in many ways, my work is also very similar. I'm often chasing news stories. I'm looking for my own unique angle. There are lots of other groups out there, and I have my own sort of pet projects. And then I guess I have the additional thing that I've been dealing with FOIA for a long time, and I'm also looking to make good FOIA law. And so there are FOIA requests that I will litigate on because I feel like there's an underlying principle there that is important. And if I can win it, I'm going to get success, not just for me, but down the road for future requesters. I would like to, sorry, I can't resist saying that if I had to sum up my FOIA experience, it's really like that Rolling Stones line, you can't always get what you want, but if you try, sometimes you get what you need. And I think that is so accurate in FOIA land. So I thought I would talk to you about a couple cases and just sort of illustrate sort of how I insert myself in the FOIA process and the issue. So the first, and this goes into looking for a unique angle or something, a red flag. Really, often I'm looking for red flags. There was you may not recall, during the day of the solar eclipse, there was a total solar eclipse, which is a very unique astronomical whatever event. And on that day, Secretary Mnuchin's wife posted on Instagram a photograph of her and her husband descending from a military plane. And the reason it got attention, it was so obnoxious, she labeled each of the items of clothing she was wearing by the designer that it was. So this got a lot of attention. It was really in poor taste, so to speak. But I was looking at, this was a trip to Lexington, Kentucky, and then Fort Knox. And I thought, that's odd. What were they doing there? Why on a military craft? And why was the wife along, right? So what I discovered was that Fort Knox was just outside the path of totality for the eclipse, where you could see, a total solar eclipse. So we filed a FOIA request, and lo and behold, we did get photographs. One of them was quite telling, with Mr. Mnuchin and Mitch McConnell standing at Fort Knox with those little sunglasses, dangling from their hands. So in many ways, this was a small sort of story that, got a lot of attention because it was kind of obnoxious. But actually, it kicked off, in some ways, a much larger story, because it then emerged that there was sort of rampant misuse in the Trump administration by cabinet officials of both private planes and military planes. In fact, former Secretary of HHS Tom Price had to resign. So it was a small window into what turned out to be a much bigger scandal. An example of where I sort of follow something that piques me, or that I have some information about, is the next case. In then Attorney General Sessions on a Friday night, and you got to watch out for those Friday night announcements from agencies. He announced that he had fired then Deputy FBI Director Andy McCabe. Now, this was 2 days before Mr. McCabe was set to retire. And he had been the subject of Trump's ire on Twitter and all, President Trump kept tweeting about he was a crook, he should go to jail. I mean, it was terrible. So Sessions said he had fired him based on an investigation by DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility and their Inspector General. Now, I spent over 20 years at the Justice Department, and one thing I know is that OPR acts very slowly. Yet in this case, supposedly, they had made a decision or a recommendation within days. And just because I knew that was so unusual, it really, was a red flag for me. And of course, lots of people were already calling, had suspicions about why Mr. McCabe really was fired. So I filed a FOIA request for documents from the OPR investigation, and I thought we should get these, right? It's a closed investigation. The Justice Department has announced the outcome of the investigation. They've announced who they fired, so there can't be a privacy interest. This should be an easy FOIA. Of course it wasn't. The Justice Department claimed categorically that there was a pending law enforcement investigation, so they could give us nothing. And I said, what are you talking about? The OPR investigation is closed. The IG investigation is closed. Are you really telling me you have a criminal investigation into Andy McCabe for what? And of course, that was what was going on. But really what was going on is that they didn't want to close it because they did not want to, they would have the president on their backs if they came out and said, we have no criminal case against Mr. McCabe. But as long as they could say there's an ongoing investigation, they could buy some time with the president. So in an interesting sort of turn of events, I had a really good judge who was highly suspicious of what was going on. And he called in the prosecutor on the case, and they would go and they'd meet in his chambers. I wasn't allowed to be there. And he'd come back and say, well, they're going to have a decision by this date, so we'll come back into court on that date. We would go back in, the same thing would get repeated. They'd go back in chambers, they'd come out. This went on a couple of times. And finally, the judge had had enough. And he said, here's a date certain, either you prosecute him or I'm going to order all the documents to be disclosed. And of course, with that deadline, they finally announced that they were not going to prosecute Andy McCabe. So it's a really weird case. It's usually the other way around, where the FOIA request is following, whatever the government decides to do. In this case, the FOIA request actually, I think, was a prime motivation in how the government handled its investigation. And the other byproduct of the FOIA request was that, we make all of our documents, and I say we, crew and public, they get posted. Andy McCabe was actually able to use them in his civil suit against the Department of Justice for unlawful termination. So that actually made me feel good as well, because I felt like he had really been treated so shabbily. And so these are examples where I'm saying, look for those red flags, or if you have some kind of unique or insider information, use it. And the final example of that has to do with, and this just happened in the last couple of months, but on a Friday night again, Special Counsel Mueller gave the Department of Justice and the Attorney General an advance copy of his report, his 2-volume report into the president and his campaign. And in less than 2 days, the Attorney General, even though the report was hundreds of pages, 2 volumes, the Attorney General wrote a letter to Congress and said, we've looked at the evidence, it's not sufficient to support an obstruction of justice prosecution of the president. And a couple of weeks later, he testified to that effect in Congress, and he added that he had made his decision based on input from the Office of Legal Counsel and senior Justice Department officials. Now, I have been doing battle for years with Justice Department to get Office of Legal Counsel opinions. They don't make them public. And the other thing that the Justice Department does, not only don't they make them public, but they're always wrapping themselves in them. They're the imprimatur of, this is legal, this is, right, this is factual, because we got an OLC opinion that told us we could do this, but hey, you can't see that opinion. So filed a FOIA request for the documents, And ultimately, I would say the dispute came down to essentially one memo that OLC had written to the Attorney General, and we litigated. And in court, the Justice Department, they had two declarants. These were long-term, non-political career people who said, what's going on here is that OLC was assessing the sufficiency of the evidence to make a prosecution decision. And we said, no, that can't be. We questioned whether the Attorney General even had the authority. We said, no, we think what's really going on. This was all about how was the Attorney General going to spin this report to the public. So because of this dispute, we asked the judge to look at the documents in camera. And this is not something, what that means is the judge gets to look at the documents. We as the requester don't. And it's not a process that I often like because it is so one-sided. You don't get to see it. But this was a case where I really felt that there was that what the government was saying about the documents wasn't accurate. And I was right, because the judge wrote an opinion that slammed the government. She said their declarations were so inconsistent with the facts as to be worthy of no credence. She said they had committed bad faith. She slammed the lawyers for relying on the declarations because she said this was not a memo about making a prosecution decision. The agency redacted at front the very beginning of the memo that said, because of longstanding Justice Department policy, we can't prosecute a sitting president. So she said, you redacted that. That was misleading, because that made it clear that the whole discussion was hypothetical. There was no prosecution decision here. There was never going to be a prosecution. So they lost, and they went up to the Court of Appeals. I was very disappointed about that, by the way, because this was a decision that Merrick Garland made to appeal this case. And they lost in the Court of Appeals, and we got the memo. And it's publicly available. And I would say take a look, even if you're not a criminal lawyer. It purports to be a dispassionate, analysis of the evidence that Mueller gathered on obstruction of justice. It could have been written by Trump's lawyers as to their own characterization of the evidence. So I think it's an important document. It's important for historical reasons. And I know we're supposed to be talking about successes, but I have to say it's a bittersweet victory, because we waited years to get that record, and had it come out at the time that the public was just seeing the Mueller report, and while both the president and Barr were in office, I think it could have really had a big impact. And that's just a frustration. It still was worth pursuing. As I said, I think it's still of historical importance. We still have the possibility that Trump may run for president again. And so certainly his prior conduct is very relevant to his qualifications to be president. But it also illustrates that, the time involved. And Nate, your story that took 2 years, it still reads, it's a very fresh, very current, very important story. Reading about something that Mueller and the Barr did 2 years ago just doesn't have that same impact. So I will stop there and answer any questions folks have.
Thanks, Anne. I can't even tell you how much I admire Anne's work, over the years. It's really been amazing. Crew has done amazing, just really created, a body of FOIA law. And I'm even saying this as a former government attorney, being on the wrong side of that a lot of the time. But, it is vital, and this is definitely a message to everybody on this session that we hold the government accountable, right? That's an incredible privilege and a responsibility as a as a citizen to be able to do that. And we have laws, albeit imperfect ones, that allow us to seek information from the government and to bring all of these incredibly important issues to light. It's hard to even fathom what the state of things would be without open records laws. How would we get this information? How would the things that the government is doing really be revealed? So thank you to all of our panelists for the incredibly important work that they've done. We do have a bunch of questions. I am going to start with we have some questions about for you, Nate, about whether there are details about the FOIA battle in the article.
Person after my own heart. I should put whoever asked that in touch with my editor. It's kind of a joke. I always say, well, we gotta say that we filed on this day, and then they didn't reply, and then we pinged them, and they say nope, just say we won the FOIA lawsuit. But that said, maybe despite me, because I pushed back a little bit, yes, there are articles in this. We do proud to say that we do use the government secrecy kind of runs through the article. If they were doing this and it was out in the open, it would be less nefarious. But because it was so secret, it certainly looks like the government doesn't want the world to know that its generals are getting paid a lot of money to work for Saudi Arabia while they're still collecting a U.S. pension. And when Saudi Arabia, at Russia's request, is cutting off the oil. So that's what it says. We do go through that. I hate to do it. I'll do it. Shameless plug. I didn't quite get in the paper, but I did do a how we did this Twitter thread. So that's on Twitter at FOIA Nate, and that has most of the primary source documents and the actual request language we used, and that should be a good start. And if that's not enough, you can talk to me.
Nate, could you give a sort of ballpark estimate of how long it took from sort of beginning to end?
Sure. Well, I think what actually is the most useful is, well, so when I talk to the reporters, a couple of things. One, again, it's only about maybe 25% of government agencies are very bad on time wise. The other 75% are quite good. So if you're the Department of Justice, unfortunately, is pretty bad. But if there's another smaller agency usually that has the docs, request from them too. And then also definitely states are almost always faster than the federal government. So definitely think states. That said, out of the way, really quick, there's expedited processing, which is very hard to get. And there's a 4-factor test that you'll look it up, and the courts have said you have to tick 4 boxes. So if you ask for expedited and don't tick the 4 boxes, you're not going to get it. That's my pro tip. And then 2, there's simple processing queue, and that's what you want to be in. There, with any agency, you have a good shot. So if you do a request and you're not in simple processing, and it's one of the 25% of bad agencies, my advice to you is call them up and say, what can I do to get into simple processing? If maybe sometimes if you say, 100 pages is complex, then you say, okay, then only give me the first 99 pages, because that's often the only realistic chance you get records to get quick. The next, you're in complex queue, and that's very bad. Then we're talking years. And then to actually answer your question, Grace, the strategic move then might be to do a constructive FOIA lawsuit. And this is I think, I wonder what Ann has to say, but usually I tell people the fastest that you're going to get documents from when you file the lawsuit is probably around 3 to 4 months. If you're lucky, a judge might start a production schedule, so you'll start to get stuff in 4 months. So if you have a really good story and you're in that complex queue, which is years, 4 months might look pretty good. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Let me see. We have a bunch of questions. So this is a question, I think, for both for really all 3 of our panelists. Once you have your documents and you've written the story, how often do you make public records backing up the reporting available for the public?
I'll just go really quick. On ours, we have really snazzy footnotes online that have the document that every allegation, you can see the actual document we got that we're very proud of on this one.
I know that Crew, they post their documents online. That's our general, and in fact, when we filed the request, we asked for fee waivers, and one of the points we make is that we are going to take these documents and we're going to post them online and make them publicly available.
I saw the footnotes in Nate's story. I thought that was pretty cool. I really like that. It stood out to me. We sometimes make the documents available. I think it depends. We often make data available, like with the lead poisoning data. We put up a map that people could search themselves, and then we have made it available to researchers and lots of people upon request. And we still get requests, it seems, pretty regularly from people that want that data.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this is, again, a question, I think, for everyone on the panel. What makes you feel confident that a government agency has done a thorough email search? What do you look for in terms of being able to determine completeness in an email set? I know this is a really hard question to answer.
Well, I'll kick it off. I mean, I think the answer is that you rarely never are confident. I mean, if you are looking for a specific set of emails and you either get them or you don't, that's easy. But, you know, it's rare. And you have the added complication that even though they're not supposed to, people use their private email accounts to send and receive work-related emails, and agency guidelines tell them to put them into their official email record-keeping system, but it often doesn't happen. So you're never confident also if you've been able to capture, you know, that subset of emails. So, I mean, the best advice I can give is if you're after emails, be as specific and narrow as possible. If you can give specific email addresses or domain names, that's helpful. If you can give terms, search terms, but I mean, at least in my experience, I'm rarely confident that I've gotten everything.
I think that's a really good tip, actually, to, as you're formulating your request, you know, even throw in there something about personal email, because I know, you know, during my tenure at DHS, I had to go to a very high level official after he had left the agency and go collect his personal email and bring it back and search it. And, you know, well, but you got to ask for it, because if you didn't, it makes it very difficult for a court even to, you know, kind of cross that bridge and say, oh yeah, I'm going to go and ask, you know, political appointee to, you know, hand over the entirety of their Gmail, you know. So, but, you know, it's one line, throw it in there. You know, I definitely think it's good insurance. I mean, you might not get on the first round, but if you sue, you know, it ups your odds considerably. Mike or Nate, anything to add?
Just in general, put yourself in the position of the agency IT person and know that they're probably using Microsoft Outlook, and think about what you would be able to search for in Microsoft Outlook and format your request so that someone searching Microsoft Outlook would be able to search what you're asking for.
Great tip.
Narrow time frames, specific individuals. I just, like I said earlier, I don't, if you don't do that, then I don't have a ton of sympathy for you when the agency comes back and says, hey, look, it's going to take 19 months and it's going to cost $100,000. I mean, because it probably really is going to take a lot of time to go through that. You're not the only one. And then, like I said earlier, it makes it so much easier if you've already seen the emails or if you're talking to somebody about the emails who know they exist.
I would caution people, there's still agencies that claim they don't have the ability to search for emails, which is, I think, a sort of absurd on its face claim. So I would really push back against that. And, you know, especially push back, the more, again, it goes to the more detail you can give. You can give search terms, you know, because I am a technical Luddite. I am a Luddite, but I know how to go into my email and put a word in and search for responses. So you may have to work with them.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I think we only have time for one more question. There's a question about whether you think that we are going to see more proactive disclosures. Do you think we're going to see them without the aid of litigation?
I think no. I think that's kind of Obama era hope idea that one never even took effect there, and now all administrations are actually running away from because it takes work. I will flag one thing: instead of just proactive disclosures, check the Post's editorial from this Sunday. The State Department had proactively put out a history of foreign relations, and it has now scrubbed it from its website. So actually, right now we're seeing this administration doing the opposite, taking down stuff that used to be public. Thankfully, it's on lots of other websites, so it's even self-defeating. But if you're interested, check it out.
I actually think it's counterintuitive for an agency to suggest that proactively disclosing is going to take away resources and make it harder. It would limit the number of FOIA requests they have. And as Nate knows, during the Obama years, we pushed hard. We had identified a whole bunch of frequently asked categories of records that run throughout all agencies. You know, who goes to visit the secretary, or contracts, etc. And we couldn't get any traction. And I've been working with people, we've been working with the Hill on legislation that, among other things, would codify a requirement to proactively disclose, but it's kind of stuck. So I'm not very optimistic that we are going to see more proactive disclosure, even though I think it is in part the answer to the big backlogs and shortage of agency resources that agencies are facing.
So, I mean, we've been focused on federal FOIA, but I mean, it seems that on the state level, we are seeing a lot more proactive disclosure. And for states make a lot of detailed, granular information available, environmental information, financial information. And I think that we will continue to see that in certain states. It might not be the states that you expect, but because of the reason that Ann said, is because it's more effective, it's cheaper. And I think they, like, on this ground level, they feel like they score points doing this. And if you have a culture like in Florida, where there is this constitutionally enshrined idea of openness, I just feel like it comes from the top down, and you'll see more of it. And I think you're even seeing more of that in Florida, the really pushing boundaries there on what they disclose.
If I could just make a quick plug for state FOIAs, many of them are different because many of them allow you to also FOIA the legislature or any entity that gets federal funding. So some of them are much more expansive than the federal FOIA. So they're really worth considering if there's a state angle to what you're looking for.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much to our panelists for this amazing discussion. Thank you for your questions from the audience. It really helps to have a really robust conversation. And I know we covered a lot of ground today. The recording will be available later, so please feel free to peruse it at your leisure. And thank you for attending today. Thanks so much.